The rain hammered the black umbrellas like bullets on steel. I stood 50 feet from my father's graveside, close enough to see the mahogany casket, but far enough that my stepmother couldn't order security to remove me. That's when I saw them approaching through the downpour, 6 Marines in dress blues, carrying the folded flag that should have been mine. My stepbrother pointed at me and shook his head violently, but those Marines kept walking, straight past the family section, straight toward me. In that moment, I knew my father had kept one final promise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sergeant Elena Vasquez, and this story begins 3 days before my father died, when I received a call that would change everything. I was stationed at Camp Pendleton, California, finishing my 3rd deployment as a combat engineer with the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. 28 years old, unmarried, and according to my family back in Phoenix, Arizona, a complete disappointment who chose explosives over marriage and military over motherhood. The voice on the phone belonged to my stepbrother, Derek Morrison, a real estate developer who'd never missed a meal or a chance to remind me that his mother, Patricia, had saved our father from the embarrassment of raising me alone. Derek's tone was clinical, businesslike, as if he were discussing a property deal rather than our father's failing heart. Your father had another episode, he said, not bothering with pleasantries. The doctors say it's serious this time. Patricia thinks you should know, but she doesn't want you disrupting his recovery with your dramatic military nonsense. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white against the black plastic. Our father. As if David Morrison had ever been anything more to Derek than a meal ticket and social status upgrade. I requested emergency leave immediately. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a woman who'd seen me disarm IEDs in Fallujah without flinching, took one look at my face and expedited the paperwork. Within 18 hours, I was on a flight to Phoenix, my dress blues pressed and folded in my carry-on bag, not knowing it would be the last time I'd wear them for my father. David Morrison was lying in the cardiac intensive care unit at Banner University Medical Center, tubes and wires transforming the man who'd taught me to drive stick shift and change oil into something fragile and unfamiliar. His eyes opened when I entered the room, and for a moment, they cleared with recognition and something that looked like relief. Elena, he whispered, his voice rough from the ventilator they'd removed that morning. You came home. I pulled a chair close to his bed and took his hand, surprised by how cold his fingers felt. Of course I came home, Dad. I always come home. He squeezed my hand with what little strength he had left, and I saw tears forming in the corners of his eyes. There's something I need to tell you, he said, glancing toward the door. Something about your mother. My biological mother, Rosa Vasquez, had died in a car accident when I was 8 years old. Patricia Morrison had married my father 2 years later, bringing Derek into our lives like a storm front that never quite passed. From that moment forward, I became the outsider in my own home, the dark-haired reminder of a woman Patricia referred to as your father's first mistake. Dad struggled to sit up straighter in the hospital bed. His breathing labored, but his eyes focused with an intensity I hadn't seen in years. Your mother, he began, then stopped as Patricia entered the room. She wore a burgundy wool dress that probably cost more than my monthly Marine salary, her blonde hair perfectly styled, despite the supposed crisis of her husband's hospitalization. David, darling, you shouldn't be straining yourself with visitors, she said, her voice honey-sweet but her eyes cold as January when they fell on me. Elena, how thoughtful of you to take leave from your little military job. She emphasized the word little, like she was describing a child's game rather than a career that had taken me through 3 combat zones. Patricia moved to the opposite side of the bed, positioning herself between my father and me like a human barrier. The nurses say you need rest, not excitement. Perhaps Elena could visit during regular hours like everyone else. My father's jaw tightened, a flash of the stubborn man who'd raised me alone for 10 years before Patricia arrived with her son and her renovations, and her slow, methodical erasure of my mother's memory from our house. Patricia, he said firmly, Elena is my daughter. She'll visit when she wants to visit. Derek chose that moment to enter the room, carrying coffee and wearing the smug expression of someone who'd never been told no in his 35 years of existence. He nodded at his mother, ignored me completely, and launched into a monologue about the morning's stock reports and his latest development project in Scottsdale. I listened to Derek discuss profit margins while our father lay dying, and I understood that this was how it had always been in the Morrison household. My stepfamily had mastered the art of treating serious moments like social gatherings and treating me like hired help who'd overstayed her welcome. When visiting hours ended, Patricia walked me to the elevator with her practiced smile and her perfectly manicured claws. "Elena, dear," she said as the elevator doors opened, "I hope you understand that David's condition is very delicate. Too much stimulation could be harmful. Perhaps it would be better if you visited less frequently." Her words were wrapped in concern, but the message was clear: stay away. I spent that night in a cheap motel near the hospital, staring at the water-stained ceiling, and remembering the last conversation I'd had with my father before this deployment. He'd called me on a Saturday morning, his voice stronger then, asking about my unit and whether I was taking care of myself. At the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, he'd said something that stuck with me. "Elena, no matter what happens, no matter what anyone tells you, remember that you're a Morrison and a Vasquez. Both parts of you matter." I'd thought it was just Dad being sentimental, maybe feeling guilty about how Patricia and Derek treated me during family gatherings. Now, lying in that motel room with the sound of traffic filtering through thin walls, I wondered if he'd been trying to tell me something more important. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital early, hoping to catch some time alone with my father before Patricia's daily performance began. His room was empty. The bed was made with military precision, the machines silent, and a nurse I didn't recognize was removing the last of the monitoring equipment. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Where is David Morrison?" The nurse looked up with sympathy that made my stomach drop. "I'm sorry, honey. Mr. Morrison passed away around 4 this morning. His family was with him." His family. I stood in the doorway of that empty room, understanding that Patricia had orchestrated this final exclusion with the same careful planning she'd used to remove my mother's photographs from the house 12 years ago. My father had died surrounded by people who'd spent the last decade treating him like a bank account with legs, while the daughter who'd inherited his stubbornness and his love of fixing broken things sat in a motel room 5 miles away. The funeral arrangements were handled by Patricia with the efficiency of a corporate merger. Memorial service at Christ the King Catholic Church, internment at Phoenix Memorial Park, reception at the Phoenician Resort. I learned about the details not from my stepfamily, but from the obituary in the Arizona Republic, which listed David Morrison as survived by his beloved wife Patricia and son Derek, with no mention of a daughter named Elena, who'd served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. I called Derek's office that afternoon, my anger carefully controlled but burning like a fuse. "I just saw Dad's obituary," I said when Derek finally took my call. "Interesting family tree you published." Derek's silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the line had gone dead. "Look, Elena," he finally said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he'd perfected during our teenage years. "This is a difficult time for Mom. She's not thinking clearly. Maybe it would be better if you didn't attend the service. It might be too emotional for everyone involved." Too emotional. As if grief were a luxury I hadn't earned. As if my father's death were somehow easier for me because I wore a uniform instead of designer clothes. I hung up on Derek without another word and drove to the funeral home, where my father's body was being prepared. The director, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Chen, confirmed what I'd suspected. Patricia had arranged everything, paid for everything, and specifically requested that military honors be limited to the flag ceremony at graveside. No honor guard, no rifle salute, no playing of taps. Just a folded flag presented to the next of kin, which according to Patricia's arrangement meant her. I left the funeral home with my jaw clenched and my hands shaking, not from sadness but from a rage that had been building for 20 years. That night I did something that went against every instinct I'd developed as a Marine. I called in a favor. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen, no relation to the funeral director, had served with me in Helmand Province, where we'd spent 7 months dodging IEDs and keeping each other sane with stories about home. Mike was stationed at Luke Air Force Base, 30 minutes from Phoenix, and when I explained the situation, his response was immediate and profane and exactly what I needed to hear. "They want to erase your dad's Marine service?" Mike said, his Brooklyn accent sharp with indignation. "Your old man served 2 tours in Vietnam before you were even born, Elena. That flag belongs to his blood family, not his checkbook family." Mike promised to make some calls, and by morning, I had 6 Marines from Luke, willing to volunteer for funeral detail on their day off. The morning of the service, I stood in front of the mirror in my motel room, adjusting my dress blue uniform for what I knew would be the last time I'd wear it for my father. The ribbons on my chest told the story of 3 deployments, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Bronze Star with Valor that I'd earned pulling wounded Marines from a burning vehicle outside Ramadi. Patricia Morrison might have erased me from the obituary, but she couldn't erase what my father had taught me about honor, duty, and standing up for what's right. The rain started falling as I drove to the church, a cold December downpour that turned Phoenix streets into rivers, and made the desert city feel more like Seattle. I parked 3 blocks away from Christ the King, close enough to see the black limousines and flower arrangements, but far enough to avoid confrontation before the service began. Through my rain-streaked windshield, I watched Derek escort Patricia from their car, both of them dressed in expensive black and sharing an umbrella that probably cost more than my monthly housing allowance. I waited until the church was full before walking through the rain to take a seat in the back pew, my uniform drawing stares and whispers from Patricia's friends and Derek's business associates. The service was everything I'd expected: sterile, polished, and focused more on Patricia's grief than on David Morrison's life. Derek delivered a eulogy that managed to mention his stepfather's successful insurance business, his love of golf, and his devotion to Patricia, without once acknowledging his 20 years of military service, or the daughter who'd followed in his footsteps. When the service ended, I followed the procession to Phoenix Memorial Park, keeping my distance as Patricia accepted condolences and Derek played the role of grieving son. The rain had intensified, turning the cemetery grounds into a muddy memorial that seemed fitting for the day my father was laid to rest by people who'd never really known him. I stood 50 feet from the graveside, close enough to hear the minister's final prayers but far enough that security couldn't claim I was disrupting the proceedings. That's when I saw them emerging through the rain like ghosts in dress blues. 6 Marines walking in formation toward the burial site, their movements precise despite the mud and the downpour. Staff Sergeant Chen led the group, carrying the folded American flag with the reverence reserved for something sacred. I watched Patricia's face change from confusion to alarm as she realized these Marines weren't part of her carefully orchestrated funeral script. Derek stepped forward, pointing at me and shaking his head violently, his mouth moving in what I assumed were threats and demands for the Marines to leave. But Mike Chen and his 5 volunteers didn't acknowledge Derek's protests or Patricia's whispered commands to security. They walked past the family section, past the expensive flower arrangements and the covered chairs reserved for immediate family, and they walked straight toward me. Staff Sergeant Chen reached me first, his face solemn beneath the brim of his cover, rainwater streaming down his dress blue uniform like tears the sky was crying for my father. He held the flag with both hands, the red, white, and blue fabric folded with the precision that only comes from years of practice and respect for what it represents. Behind him, the other 5 Marines formed a semicircle, their presence commanding enough that even the cemetery workers had stopped their preparations to watch. On behalf of the President of the United States, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and a grateful nation, Chen said, his voice carrying across the cemetery despite the rain, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your father's honorable and faithful service. He placed the flag in my hands, and I felt the weight of it, not just the fabric and the perfect folds, but everything it carried with it. 26 years of my father's life before I was born, 2 tours in Vietnam that he rarely talked about, and the pride he'd felt when I earned my Eagle Globe and Anchor. I clutched the flag against my chest, feeling the tears I'd been holding back for 3 days finally break free. The rain disguised them, but I knew these Marines understood grief that came with bagpipes and folded flags and words that could never quite capture what we'd lost. Thank you, I managed to whisper, my voice cracking on words that felt inadequate for what they'd just given me. Patricia's voice cut through the rain like a blade. Excuse me, she called out, her heels clicking on the wet pavement as she approached our group. I don't know who arranged this little performance, but this is a private family gathering. Security, I need you to escort these people away from the service. Derek flanked her, his face red with indignation that someone had dared to disrupt his mother's carefully scripted farewell. Chen turned slowly to face Patricia, his expression respectful but immovable. "Ma'am," he said, his Brooklyn accent softening with military courtesy, "we're here to honor Staff Sergeant David Morrison, United States Marine Corps, and to ensure his daughter receives the recognition she deserves as his next of kin." Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, clearly unprepared for someone to challenge her authority with facts instead of social pressure. "She is not immediate family," Derek interjected, stepping forward with the aggressive posture of someone who'd never been in a real fight. "My mother is the legal widow and rightful recipient of any military honors. These people need to leave before I call the police." The 5 Marines behind Chen shifted slightly, not threatening but unmistakably present, their silence speaking louder than any words could have. Lance Corporal Williams, a young black Marine with kind eyes and scars on his hands that spoke of deployment experience, stepped forward. "Sir," he said to Derek, his voice respectful but firm, "with respect, military honors follow bloodline, not marriage certificates. Sergeant Vasquez is Staff Sergeant Morrison's biological daughter, and a decorated Marine herself. She has every right to receive this flag." Patricia's carefully constructed composure began to crack around the edges. Her voice rose to a pitch that carried across the cemetery, drawing stares from the other mourners who'd been pretending not to watch our confrontation. "This is outrageous," she shrieked. "David specifically told me he wanted a civilian service. He didn't want military pageantry turning his funeral into some kind of political statement." The lie hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making me take a step backward. My father had been proud of his Marine service until the day he died, proud of the young men he'd served with in Da Nang, proud of the daughter who'd followed him into the Corps. Patricia had spent 18 years slowly erasing his military identity, replacing his dress blue photographs with golf tournament pictures, throwing away his old uniforms during her redecorating projects, discouraging him from attending Marine Corps birthday celebrations because they were too rowdy for her social circle. Chen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a reaction I recognized from dealing with officers who'd never seen combat but insisted on micromanaging those who had. "Ma'am," he said, his voice still controlled but carrying an edge that made Derek take a step backward, "Staff Sergeant Morrison earned the right to military honors through 26 years of faithful service to this country. No one can take that away from him, just like no one can take away his daughter's right to grieve him as a Marine grieves a fallen comrade." The cemetery security guard, an older Hispanic man who'd been watching our exchange with growing discomfort, approached cautiously. He looked at Patricia, then at the Marines, then at me holding the flag against my chest like armor. "Ma'am," he said to Patricia, "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. Other families are trying to hold services, and we need to maintain respect for all the deceased." Patricia whirled on the security guard with fury that had been building since the moment she realized she couldn't control this narrative. "You need to remove these people immediately," she demanded. "They're disrupting a private funeral and harassing the family. I want them arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace." The security guard glanced at the Marines, who stood at attention in the rain with the quiet dignity that comes from facing mortar fire and hostile governments, then looked back at Patricia with poorly concealed skepticism. "Ma'am," the guard said carefully, "this is a public cemetery, and these gentlemen appear to be conducting themselves appropriately. Unless someone is being physically threatened or preventing the burial from proceeding, I don't have grounds to remove anyone." Patricia's face flushed red enough to compete with her burgundy dress, her carefully applied makeup beginning to run in the rain like watercolors on wet paper. Derek pulled out his cell phone with the dramatic flourish of someone accustomed to solving problems through connections and money. "I'm calling my attorney," he announced, to no one in particular. "This harassment won't stand. My stepfather built a reputation in this community, and I won't have it tarnished by some staged military stunt designed to embarrass our family." Corporal Jackson, a stocky Marine with gentle eyes and hands scarred from working with explosives, shook his head slowly. "Brother," he said to Derek, his southern drawl thick with disappointment, "ain't nobody here trying to embarrass your family. We're just making sure a Marine gets the send-off he earned, and his daughter gets the respect she deserves. If that embarrasses you, maybe you should ask yourself why." The truth of those words hung in the air between us like smoke from a battlefield. Impossible to ignore, and impossible to take back. I looked at Derek, this man who'd lived in my father's house for 18 years, eaten at his table, accepted his financial support through college and business ventures, and I realized he'd never once asked my father about Vietnam, or thanked him for his service, or acknowledged that the comfortable life he'd inherited was built on the back of a man who'd volunteered to fight in an unpopular war because he believed in something bigger than himself. The minister, an elderly priest who'd been waiting patiently for our family drama to resolve itself, approached with the cautious air of someone accustomed to mediating conflicts between grief and pride. Perhaps, he suggested gently, we could complete the interment service and allow everyone to pay their respects as they see fit. The deceased would want his final moments to be peaceful, not contentious. Patricia spun toward the priest with wild eyes, her voice rising to near hysteria. Father McKenna, these people are making a mockery of David's wishes. He specifically requested a quiet, dignified service without military displays. They're turning his funeral into a circus, and I demand you ask them to leave immediately. Father McKenna looked at Patricia with the patient expression of someone who'd spent 40 years listening to people lie about the wishes of the dead. Mrs. Morrison, he said quietly, I spoke with David many times about his military service. He was quite proud of his time in the Marines and especially proud of his daughter's service. I don't believe he would object to Elena receiving military honors. The priest's words hit Patricia like a slap across the face, destroying the carefully constructed narrative she'd been building since my father's death. For 18 years, she'd slowly rewritten his history, convinced him that his military service was something to be quietly forgotten rather than celebrated, that his daughter's career was an embarrassment rather than an achievement. Now, in front of the social circle she'd worked so hard to impress, the truth was being spoken by a man whose authority she couldn't challenge. I watched my stepmother realize that she'd lost control of the story she'd been telling herself and everyone else about who David Morrison really was. The man she'd married wasn't the country club golfer she'd created in her mind. He was a Marine who'd served his country in wartime, who'd raised a daughter alone for 10 years, who'd been proud of the woman she'd become even when it meant choosing duty over dinner parties and deployment over debutante balls. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, a female Marine with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen her share of family drama during military funerals, stepped forward. Mrs. Morrison, she said respectfully, we understand this is a difficult day for everyone. We're not here to cause additional pain or to disrespect your grief. We're here because Sergeant Vasquez called in a favor, and Marines don't leave Marines behind, even when one of us is grieving alone. Her words stripped away all the posturing and politics and social maneuvering, reducing our confrontation to its essential truth. First was a Marine who'd lost her father, and these 6 Marines had shown up in the rain to make sure I didn't face that loss alone. Patricia could call it a circus, or a political statement, or whatever helped her sleep at night, but what it really was simple human decency dressed in dress blue uniforms. The rain began to ease as the cemetery workers approached with subtle impatience, ready to complete the burial so they could move on to the next family, the next grief, the next awkward moment where love and loss collided with pride and social expectations. Father McKenna cleared his throat and looked at all of us with the weary authority of someone who'd presided over too many funerals, where the living caused more drama than the dead ever had. Shall we proceed with laying David to rest? He asked, his voice carrying just enough steel to remind everyone present that this moment was supposed to be about honoring a life, not settling family scores. Patricia nodded stiffly, her anger held in check by the realization that she'd already lost the moral high ground in front of the very people she'd hoped to impress with her dignified widowhood. As the priest began the final prayers, I held my father's flag and felt something shift inside my chest, a weight I'd been carrying for 18 years finally beginning to lift. These Marines didn't know my father personally, but they understood what he represented. They understood that service mattered, that sacrifice deserved recognition, and that family was sometimes defined by shared values rather than shared DNA. The burial concluded with the mechanical efficiency of cemetery operations, dirt falling onto mahogany wood with hollow thuds that seemed to echo longer than they should have. Patricia and Derek departed quickly, their expensive shoes clicking against wet pavement as they hurried toward their limousine without a backward glance. The other mourners followed suit, conversations resuming in hushed tones about dinner plans and business meetings, the disruption of military protocol already becoming tomorrow's gossip at the country club. I remained beside the fresh grave, still clutching the flag against my chest, watching the cemetery workers begin their methodical cleanup. The 6 Marines stood with me in comfortable silence, their presence a shield against the loneliness that threatened to overwhelm me now that the confrontation had ended. Staff Sergeant Chen checked his watch, then looked at me with the concern of someone who understood that the real grief often began after the ceremonies ended. "Sergeant Vasquez," he said quietly, "we need to head back to base soon, but we wanted to make sure you're okay before we leave. Is there anything else we can do for you today?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to speak. The magnitude of what these Marines had done for me was still settling in my chest like warm coffee on a cold morning, spreading comfort through places that had been numb for too long. Lance Corporal Williams stepped forward, pulling a small notebook from his breast pocket. He tore out a page and handed it to me, his handwriting neat despite the rain that had spotted the paper. "That's my contact information," he said. "I know what it's like to lose family, and have nobody understand what that means to a Marine. If you ever need to talk to someone who gets it, you call me. Day or night, doesn't matter." The other Marines murmured agreement, each of them offering similar support, with the quiet sincerity that marked genuine brotherhood. These men didn't know me beyond the phone call from Staff Sergeant Chen, but they understood something that Patricia and Derek never would: that Marines take care of Marines, even when those Marines are strangers united only by shared values and mutual respect. Corporal Jackson pulled out his own phone and showed me a photo of a young Marine in dress blues, his smile bright against the formal backdrop of an official portrait. "That's my little brother Tommy," he said, his voice soft with pride and pain. "Lost him in Helmand 2 years ago. His wife's family tried to pull the same stunt at his funeral, said military honors were too dramatic for their suburban sensibilities." Jackson's jaw tightened with remembered anger. Nobody should have to fight for the right to grieve their family the way they need to grieve. Sergeant Rodriguez nodded, her expression understanding in the way that only comes from personal experience. "My father was Air Force, 22 years, she said. "When he died, my stepmother tried to have him buried in civilian clothes, because she thought his uniform made him look too serious in the casket." She looked at the flag in my arms with recognition. "Sometimes the living need to honor the dead more than the dead need to be honored, but that doesn't make it any less important." As the Marines prepared to leave, Staff Sergeant Chen handed me a challenge coin, its weight substantial in my palm despite its small size. The eagle, globe, and anchor gleamed despite the overcast sky, and I could feel the raised letters spelling out Semper Fidelis around the border. "This belonged to your father," Chen said, his voice carrying the gravity of something significant. "He gave it to me in 1995 when I was a young corporal struggling with PTSD after my first deployment. Told me to pass it on to another Marine who needed to remember they weren't alone." I stared at the coin, my father's coin, trying to process how it had found its way to Staff Sergeant Chen and why my father had never mentioned giving it away. Chen seemed to understand my confusion because he continued speaking, his words careful and deliberate. "Your dad and I served together briefly at Camp Pendleton when I was first stationed there. He talked about you all the time, showed everyone pictures of you at boot camp graduation, bragged about your deployments like you'd single-handedly won the war on terror." The revelation hit me like incoming mortar fire, sudden and devastating. My father had been proud of me, had talked about me to his fellow Marines, had carried my photograph and shared my achievements with people who understood what they meant. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. All those years of feeling like an embarrassment to the Morrison family, and my father had been quietly celebrating my successes with the only audience that truly mattered to him: other Marines who understood the weight of service and sacrifice. Chen watched my face as the truth settled in, his expression gentle with understanding. He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I'd make sure you knew that you were his greatest achievement, not his biggest disappointment. Said Patricia and Derek would try to convince you otherwise, but that Marines don't abandon Marines, even when those Marines happen to be their daughters. The tears came freely then, mixing with the rain that had started falling again, washing away 18 years of accumulated doubt and resentment. My father had seen the conflict coming, had prepared for this moment by ensuring I'd have Marines to stand with me when his own family failed to show up. The challenge coin in my palm wasn't just a token of brotherhood. It was my father's final gift, his way of making sure I'd never have to face the world alone. After the Marines departed, I walked slowly through the cemetery toward my rental car, my father's flag tucked carefully under my jacket to protect it from the rain. The parking lot was nearly empty now, just a few maintenance vehicles and my small sedan sitting beneath the gray December sky. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, not ready to drive anywhere yet, not ready to figure out what came next now that my father was buried, and Patricia had made it clear I was no longer welcome in the house where I'd grown up. My phone buzzed with a text message from Derek. Mom wants Dad's military stuff out of the house by tomorrow. It's upsetting her to see reminders. I'll leave boxes on the porch. Don't come to the door. The casual cruelty of it should have surprised me, but instead I felt something like relief. Patricia was giving me permission to cut ties with people who'd never really been family anyway, who'd spent 18 years trying to convince me that my father's love was something I'd imagined, rather than something I'd earned. I drove to my father's house that evening, arriving after dark, to find 3 cardboard boxes stacked beside the front door like garbage, waiting for pickup. Inside those boxes, I discovered the remnants of David Morrison's life before Patricia, his dress blue uniform, still pressed and hanging in a garment bag, photograph albums from his Marine Corps service, faces of young men who'd served beside him in Vietnam, letters he'd written home to his parents during his deployments, filled with homesickness and determination and the kind of raw emotion he'd rarely shown in civilian life. At the bottom of the largest box, wrapped in tissue paper, I found something that made me sink to my knees on the front porch. My mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved, along with a letter addressed to me in my father's handwriting. The envelope was sealed and dated just 1 month before his death, as if he'd known his time was running short and wanted to make sure his words reached me. Elena, the letter began, "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Patricia probably made sure you didn't get to say goodbye properly. I'm sorry for that, and I'm sorry for a lot of things I should have done differently over the years. I should have stood up to Patricia more when she tried to erase your mother's memory from our house. I should have told Derek to respect you instead of letting him treat you like an inconvenience. Most of all, I should have told you every day how proud I am of the Marine you became." The letter continued for 3 pages, my father's careful handwriting describing memories I'd forgotten and expressing pride in achievements I'd assumed he'd never noticed. He wrote about the day I'd called to tell him I'd made it through the crucible at Paris Island, how he'd hung up the phone and cried tears of joy while Patricia complained about the collect call charges. He wrote about staying awake during my deployments, following news from Iraq and Afghanistan, with the terror of a parent who understood exactly what his daughter was facing in combat zones. "Your mother would be so proud of who you've become," the letter concluded. "She always said you had her courage and my stubborn streak, and that combination would either get you killed or make you unstoppable." I'm glad she was right about the unstoppable part. The flag they give you at my funeral belongs to you, not because you're my daughter, but because you earned it through your own service. Semper Fi, Elena. Your dad. I sat on that porch until midnight, reading and rereading my father's words, understanding finally that the distance I'd felt in recent years hadn't been about his disappointment in me, but about his inability to bridge the gap between the Marine father who'd raised me and the country club husband Patricia had tried to mold him into. He'd chosen peace in his household over conflict, but he'd never stopped being proud of the daughter who'd followed him into the Corps. The next morning, I drove to the Marine Corps recruiting station where my journey had begun 10 years earlier. Gunnery Sergeant Maria Santos, the same woman who'd sworn me in as an 18-year-old recruit, was still there, her hair grayer now, but her bearing as sharp as ever. She looked up from her paperwork when I entered, her face breaking into a smile that warmed the small office like sunshine. "Sergeant Vasquez," she said, standing to embrace me with the familiarity of someone who'd watched me grow from a confused teenager into a confident Marine. "I heard about your father. I'm sorry for your loss, but I heard about what happened at the funeral too. Word travels fast in the Marine community, especially when Marines take care of Marines the way they should." I told her about the letter, about the boxes Patricia had left on the porch, about the challenge coin that had found its way back to me through Staff Sergeant Chen. Gunny Santos listened with the attention she'd always given to young Marines who needed guidance, her expression thoughtful as I described my father's hidden pride and Patricia's public rejection. "Your father came to see me about 6 months ago," Santos said when I finished talking. "He wanted to know about your deployments, about what you'd accomplished, about whether there were any commendations he should know about that you hadn't mentioned in your letters home. Said he was working on something special for you but wanted to make sure he had all the facts straight." She pulled out a file folder from her desk drawer, thick with paperwork and official documents. "Turns out he'd been working with Congressman Martinez's office to nominate you for a Navy Cross upgrade based on your actions in Fallujah. Had all the witness statements, medical reports, everything needed to make the case. The nomination was submitted 2 weeks before he died. The revelation left me speechless, staring at documents that proved my father had been fighting for my recognition, even when I'd assumed he'd lost interest in my career. The Navy Cross was the second highest decoration for valor in combat, and my father had been quietly building a case for why my Bronze Star should be upgraded to reflect the true scope of what had happened during that convoy ambush outside Fallujah. He was proud of you, Elena, Santos said, her voice gentle with understanding. He just didn't know how to show it in a way that wouldn't cause problems at home. But when it came to official recognition for your service, he made sure the right people knew what kind of Marine his daughter really was. I left the recruiting station with a new understanding of who my father had been and what he'd tried to accomplish, in the complicated balance between family peace and paternal pride. The boxes Patricia had discarded contained more than military memorabilia. They contained evidence of a love that had persisted despite social pressure and family conflict. 6 months later, I received orders to Camp Lejeune for my next assignment, and I made the decision to take my father's ashes with me. Patricia had him cremated after the burial, claiming it was more convenient than maintaining a gravesite, but she'd offered me half the ashes with the casual indifference of someone dividing up household goods after a divorce. I scattered David Morrison's ashes at sunrise on a North Carolina beach, reading aloud from the letters he'd written home from Vietnam, sharing his words with the Atlantic Ocean and the endless sky. Staff Sergeant Chen had driven down from Quantico to stand with me, bringing 5 other Marines who'd known my father or simply understood the importance of making sure Marines weren't honored alone. As we stood in formation on that beach, watching the sun rise over water that stretched to horizons my father would never see, I understood that family wasn't always about blood or marriage certificates or legal documents. Sometimes family was about shared values and mutual respect, and the willingness to show up when showing up mattered most. The challenge coin my father had given to Staff Sergeant Chen remained in my pocket, a reminder that Marines never stop being Marines, even when they become fathers, even when they die, even when their civilian families try to erase their service from the official record. My father had kept his promise to me in the only way he knew how, ensuring that when Patricia and Derek failed to honor who he really was, other Marines would step forward to make sure his daughter knew she wasn't alone. The Navy Cross arrived 3 months later, delivered by a general who'd known my father personally and wanted to make sure the upgrade ceremony happened with proper military honors. I wore my dress blues that day, standing at attention as the citation was read aloud, hearing my father's words in the recommendation letter that had made the difference between recognition and obscurity. Patricia and Derek weren't invited to the ceremony, and I didn't miss them. The Marines who stood with me that day understood something that civilian family never could. That honor earned in combat belongs to those who understand its true cost, and that the highest tribute we can pay to the fallen is to ensure their sacrifice is remembered by people who know what sacrifice really means. 2 years have passed since that rainy December morning when 6 Marines walked through the cemetery to deliver my father's flag, and I've learned that healing doesn't follow a schedule or respect a timeline. Some days I wake up angry at Patricia for the 18 years she stole from my relationship with my father. Other days I feel grateful that her cruelty finally pushed me toward people who understood what it meant to carry both grief and pride in the same heart. I kept my father's house in Phoenix, despite the memories that lived in every room like ghosts I couldn't quite exorcise. Patricia had redecorated extensively during her marriage to my father, covering his military history with chintz curtains and inspirational wall art, but traces of the man he'd been before her influence remained hidden in places she'd never thought to look. Behind a loose baseboard in his bedroom, I found a small wooden box containing every letter I'd ever written him, from basic training, advanced infantry training, and 3 combat deployments. The letters were arranged chronologically, each one carefully folded and stored in order, some of them showing wear from repeated reading. In the margins of several, my father had written notes in pencil, proud of her, next to a paragraph where I described earning my combat engineer badge, just like her mother, beside a story about helping injured civilians during a humanitarian mission in Afghanistan. These small annotations revealed a man who'd treasured every detail of my military career, even when he couldn't express that pride openly in his own home. I also discovered that my father had been making monthly donations to the Marine Corps Scholarship Foundation for the past 5 years, specifically requesting that the money go toward children of Marines killed in action. The foundation sent me copies of thank you letters from recipients, young people whose fathers and mothers had died serving their country, whose education was being funded by a man they'd never met but who understood the weight of their loss. Reading those letters, I began to understand that my father's pride in my service had extended beyond personal satisfaction into active support for other military families facing challenges he recognized from his own experience. He'd found ways to honor the Corps and support Marines even when his home life required him to keep those activities private, demonstrating a loyalty that transcended the social pressures Patricia had used to shape their marriage. The house gradually became a place of healing rather than painful memories as I slowly reclaimed spaces that had been sanitized of military history. I converted Patricia's formal dining room into an office where I could work on my degree in social work, a career change I'd decided to pursue after realizing how much I'd benefited from the support of Marines who understood trauma and transition. The walls that had once displayed Patricia's collection of decorative plates now held photographs of my father in uniform, my mother before her death, and the Marines who'd become my chosen family. Staff Sergeant Chen became a regular visitor, driving down from Luke Air Force Base on weekends to help with home repairs, and to share stories about my father that I'd never heard. Through Chen, I learned that my father had volunteered at the Veterans Administration Hospital every Tuesday for the past 3 years, reading to blind veterans and playing chess with men whose minds had been wounded by wars they'd fought decades ago. The hospital staff remembered David Morrison as a quiet man who never talked about his own service but seemed to understand the particular loneliness that came with surviving combat when so many others hadn't. He'd brought books, magazines, and patience to men who'd been forgotten by families that couldn't handle the damage war had left behind, offering presence without judgment and companionship without questions. I began volunteering at the same VA hospital, initially hoping to understand this part of my father's life that Patricia had never mentioned. The veterans I met there taught me that healing from loss was often a communal activity, that grief shared among people who understood its shape was lighter than grief carried alone. Many of these men had lost touch with civilian families who couldn't comprehend what they'd experienced, but they'd found brotherhood among other veterans who spoke the same language of service and sacrifice. Corporal Jackson, one of the Marines who'd stood with me at my father's funeral, introduced me to a support group for veterans dealing with family rejection. The group met monthly at a community center in downtown Phoenix, bringing together men and women whose military service had created rifts with parents, spouses, and children who couldn't understand why duty had taken precedence over domestic expectations. Their stories echoed my own experience in different variations. Parents who'd been embarrassed by sons who'd chosen enlisted service over college, spouses who'd grown tired of deployments and moves, and the emotional distance that sometimes accompanied combat experience. Children who'd inherited civilian resentment toward military culture and expressed it through rejection of veteran parents. We shared coffee, conversation, and the understanding that families could be built around shared values, as well as shared genetics. Through this group, I met Angela Rodriguez, a Navy veteran whose parents had disowned her for joining the military instead of pursuing the teaching career they'd planned for her life. Angela had served 2 tours as a hospital corpsman in Iraq, earning a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star for treating wounded Marines under fire. But her parents viewed her service as rebellion against their expectations, rather than dedication to something larger than herself. Angela and I became close friends, bonding over the peculiar pain of being rejected by people who'd never bothered to understand what we'd sacrificed for principles they claimed to share. We spent hours talking about the difference between the love offered by biological family and the loyalty earned within military community, trying to make sense of why civilian families often seemed threatened by the bonds formed through shared danger and mutual dependence. One evening, Angela shared a letter she'd received from her mother after 5 years of silence. The letter apologized for the harsh words spoken when Angela had first enlisted, acknowledged pride in her daughter's achievements, and expressed regret for missing so many years of Angela's life due to stubborn pride and misplaced disappointment. Angela's mother had finally understood that military service represented character rather than defiance, dedication rather than rebellion. I envied Angela's reconciliation while simultaneously feeling relief that my own situation had resolved with clarity rather than ambiguity. Patricia would never write me a letter acknowledging my father's pride or expressing regret for the pain she'd caused. Derek would never recognize that his stepfather had been prouder of my military achievements than any business deal or social connection. Their rejection was complete and final, which meant I could stop hoping for change and focus on building relationships with people who valued what I offered, rather than resenting what I'd chosen. The Marine community embraced me with the thoroughness that comes from shared experience and mutual respect. First began attending Marine Corps birthday celebrations, participating in veteran parades, and helping coordinate support for Marines transitioning from active duty to civilian careers. These activities connected me to a network of people who understood both the pride and the challenges that came with military service, who celebrated achievements without needing explanations, and offered support without requiring justification. Lance Corporal Williams, the young Marine who'd offered his contact information at my father's funeral, became a close friend whose own family struggles had created space for understanding my situation. Williams had grown up in foster care, aging out of the system at 18, and joining the Marines because he needed structure and purpose more than he needed college or career training. The Corps had become his family in the most literal sense, providing not just employment but identity, community, and belonging. Through Williams, I learned that many Marines carried complicated relationships with civilian families who'd never understood their choice of service. Some had been rejected outright, like Angela and me. Others maintained superficial connections marked by tension and misunderstanding, attending holiday gatherings where their military experience was treated as an embarrassing phase rather than a source of pride. The Marines who'd supported me at my father's funeral had all experienced some version of family conflict related to their service. Staff Sergeant Chen's parents had immigrated from Taiwan, hoping their son would become a doctor or engineer, not a career military man who spent years away from home fighting wars they didn't understand. Sergeant Rodriguez had left behind a marriage that couldn't survive multiple deployments, and a husband who'd grown resentful of sharing his wife with the Marine Corps. Yet these Marines had found ways to build meaningful lives around military community, creating chosen families that provided support, understanding, and unconditional acceptance. They'd learned that blood relationships weren't automatically superior to bonds forged through shared hardship and mutual sacrifice, that loyalty earned through trust was often stronger than loyalty assumed through genetics. I began speaking at veteran support groups, sharing my story about family rejection and military community acceptance. Many veterans struggled with similar conflicts, feeling torn between civilian families who demanded they minimize their military experience and veteran communities that celebrated their service. My experience offered hope that it was possible to grieve the family relationships that couldn't survive military service, while simultaneously building new relationships that honored both personal history and current values. The speaking engagements led to opportunities for advocacy work with organizations supporting military families in crisis. I testified before state legislative committees about the need for better mental health resources for veterans dealing with family rejection, contributed to research studies examining the impact of civilian-military cultural divides on veteran well-being, and helped develop programs connecting isolated veterans with supportive communities. This work gave new meaning to my father's death and the painful circumstances surrounding his funeral. The rejection I'd experienced from Patricia and Derek had pushed me toward a deeper understanding of military community and veteran support networks. Without their cruelty, I might never have discovered the strength that came from building family around shared values, rather than shared genetics. On the second anniversary of my father's death, I organized a memorial service at the VA hospital where he'd volunteered. 50 people attended, including veterans he'd befriended, staff members who'd appreciated his quiet service, and Marines from across Arizona who'd heard about his story through military networks. We shared memories, read from letters he'd written during his Vietnam service, and honored his commitment to supporting other veterans long after his own combat experience had ended. Patricia and Derek were not invited, and I felt no guilt about their exclusion. This service was for people who'd known David Morrison as a Marine, rather than as Patricia's husband, who'd understood his sense of duty and shared his commitment to serving others. The tears shed that day were tears of gratitude rather than grief, appreciation for a life well lived rather than sorrow for opportunities missed. After the service, Staff Sergeant Chen pulled me aside to share one final story about my father. 6 months before his death, my father had asked Chen to promise that if anything happened to him, Chen would make sure I knew about a trust fund he'd established for Marines' children whose parents had been killed in action. The fund was substantial, built through careful investments and regular contributions over 15 years, designed to provide college scholarships for young people facing the same challenges my father had confronted when my mother died. The trust fund was administered through the Marine Corps Heritage Foundation, with my name listed as the primary trustee after my father's death. Patricia had never known about its existence because my father had funded it through a separate bank account she'd never accessed, using money from investments she'd assumed were designated for retirement. Learning about this trust fund completed my understanding of who my father had really been beneath the country club persona Patricia had helped him construct. He'd been a Marine who never stopped taking care of Marines, who'd found ways to serve his community and honor his values, even when his personal circumstances required discretion and privacy. The 6 Marines who'd carried my father's flag through the rain that December morning had given me more than military honors and family support. They'd introduced me to a community that understood both loss and resilience, that knew how to transform pain into purpose and grief into service. Through them, I discovered that the most important inheritance my father had left me wasn't a house or money or even his flag, but the example of how to live with honor and serve with humility regardless of personal cost. 5 years have passed since that cold December morning when 6 Marines changed the trajectory of my life by walking through rain to deliver my father's flag. Today, I stand in the same Phoenix cemetery, but this time I'm not alone in my grief. Beside me stands my chosen family, Staff Sergeant Chen, now retired and working as a counselor for transitional veterans; Lance Corporal Williams, who earned his bachelor's degree in psychology and joins me in advocacy work; Sergeant Rodriguez, whose own journey through family rejection led her to become a family therapist specializing in military relationships. We're here to dedicate a memorial bench donated by the David Morrison Trust Fund, a simple granite seat overlooking the section where military veterans are buried. The inscription reads, "In honor of all who served with pride and were loved with understanding." It's a quiet monument to something Patricia and Derek could never comprehend: that respect earned through service creates bonds stronger than blood relationships based on convenience and social expectation. The dedication ceremony draws a small crowd of people whose lives intersected with my father's legacy in ways I'm still discovering. Maria Santos, now a civilian working with Veteran Placement Services, drives up from Tucson with 3 young Marines she's mentoring through their transition to college life. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a VA psychologist who worked with many of the veterans my father visited during his hospital volunteering, brings photographs of men whose final months were brightened by his quiet presence and patient conversation. Among the attendees, I notice a young woman in civilian clothes who approaches me hesitantly after the formal dedication concludes. She introduces herself as Sarah Chen, no relation to Staff Sergeant Chen, and explains that her father was one of the veterans my father had befriended during his Tuesday hospital visits. Her father had died 6 months ago, but not before telling Sarah about the Marine, who'd read to him every week and played chess without ever winning a game intentionally. Sarah's father had been a Vietnam veteran, whose family had distanced themselves from his struggles with PTSD and alcohol abuse, leaving him isolated in a VA nursing facility where days stretched into weeks without visitors. My father's weekly presence had provided the companionship that biological family had withdrawn, offering dignity and conversation to a man whose wounds from war had outlasted his welcome in civilian relationships. Through Sarah, I learn about dozens of similar connections my father had cultivated quietly. reaching out to isolated veterans whose families couldn't handle the complexities of post-combat life. He'd understood their struggles from personal experience, having navigated his own challenges with readjusting to civilian expectations after Vietnam, and he'd offered what they needed most: presence without judgment, and conversation without agenda. The memorial bench becomes a gathering place for this extended community of people touched by my father's quiet service. Veterans stop by to rest during cemetery visits. Family members of deceased service members find solace in the peaceful spot. And occasionally, active duty Marines use the bench as a meeting place when coordinating support for transitional veterans facing housing or employment challenges. I visit the bench monthly, usually bringing fresh flowers and sometimes bringing work from my position with the Veterans Crisis Intervention Program, a nonprofit I helped establish using seed money from my father's trust fund. The program specializes in supporting military families dealing with rejection, estrangement, and the unique challenges that arise when civilian relatives cannot accept or understand military service. Our program has helped hundreds of veterans navigate family conflicts similar to what I experienced with Patricia and Derek. Some situations resolve through mediation and education, helping civilian family members understand military culture and appreciate the sacrifice inherent in service. Other cases result in veterans choosing to build new families around military community, accepting that biological relationships cannot always survive the cultural gap between civilian and military values. The program's success stems from our understanding that each family conflict is unique, requiring individualized approaches rather than one-size-fits-all solutions. We provide counseling, legal advocacy, housing assistance, and community connections, helping veterans transition from family rejection to community acceptance with dignity and support. One of our most successful initiatives connects rejected veterans with military families who understand the value of service and welcome additional family members. These adoptive relationships often provide the acceptance and understanding that biological families couldn't offer, creating chosen families based on shared values rather than shared genetics. Through this work, I've met countless veterans whose stories echo mine in different variations. Robert Kim, an Army medic whose Korean immigrant parents viewed his military service as failure to achieve the professional success they'd sacrificed to provide. Jennifer Martinez, a Navy pilot whose conservative religious family couldn't accept that their daughter had chosen a career that required her to carry weapons and potentially take lives. Each veteran's journey toward healing follows a different path, but most discover that recovery requires grieving the family relationships that couldn't survive military service, while simultaneously building new relationships that honor both their personal history and their current values. This process isn't easy or quick, but it's possible with proper support and community connection. My own healing has involved learning to separate my father's love from Patricia's rejection, understanding that his inability to openly express pride in my service reflected the constraints of his marriage, rather than absence of paternal affection. The letters, donations, and trust fund he'd established revealed a man who'd found creative ways to support military families, even when his own domestic situation required discretion. The challenge coin my father had given to Staff Sergeant Chan remains in my desk drawer, not as a memento of loss but as a reminder of continuing obligation. Marines take care of Marines, as Chan had said that day in the cemetery, and that responsibility extends beyond active duty into civilian life and community service. I've given away copies of that coin to veterans I've helped through our program, each one engraved with my father's initials and the date of our cemetery encounter. The recipients understand that accepting the coin means committing to support other veterans facing similar challenges, continuing the cycle of mutual aid that defines military community at its best. Last month, I received a phone call from Derek, the first contact we'd had since Patricia's death 18 months ago. She'd died of cancer, he explained, and during the final weeks of her illness, she'd asked him to return some items she'd been storing in her bedroom closet. The items included my mother's jewelry, photographs of my parents' wedding, and a letter addressed to me in Patricia's handwriting. Derek's tone was different than I remembered, lacking the condescending arrogance that had characterized our interactions during my father's lifetime. Perhaps Patricia's death had forced him to confront his own mortality and the relationships he'd damaged through selfishness and social ambition. He asked if he could drive to Phoenix to deliver the items personally, saying he had things he wanted to discuss face to face. I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a coffee shop near the VA hospital where my father had volunteered. Derek arrived looking older than his 40 years, his expensive clothes unable to disguise the weight loss and fatigue that accompanied prolonged caregiving for a terminally ill parent. He placed a small wooden box on the table between us, his hands shaking slightly as he pushed it in my direction. Inside the box, I found treasures Patricia had hidden for 25 years. My mother's engagement ring, a gold locket containing photographs of my parents during their courtship, and a bundle of love letters my father had written to my mother during his Vietnam deployment. At the bottom of the box lay Patricia's letter, sealed in an envelope bearing my name in her distinctive handwriting. The letter was 3 pages long, written in the careful script of someone who'd chosen each word deliberately. Patricia acknowledged the pain she'd caused through her treatment of me, admitted that her jealousy of my mother's memory had influenced her behavior toward me, and expressed regret for the 18 years of family conflict that had prevented her from appreciating my military achievements. She wrote about watching my father's face during television news reports from Iraq and Afghanistan, seeing his terror for my safety and his pride in my service, understanding finally that his love for me had never diminished, despite the constraints their marriage had placed on his ability to express it openly. Patricia had realized, too late, that her attempts to erase my mother's influence from our family had hurt everyone involved, including herself. The letter concluded with an apology I'd stopped hoping to receive, and an acknowledgement I'd never expected, that my service to our country represented the best qualities my father had possessed, and that rejecting me had been rejecting the parts of him she'd claimed to love most. Derek watched me read his mother's letter, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes showing the regret of someone who'd participated in family dynamics he now recognized as cruel and destructive. When I finished reading, he cleared his throat and spoke quietly about his own memories of our childhood, acknowledging behavior he'd justified at the time but now understood as selfish and hurtful. He talked about feeling threatened by my relationship with his stepfather, fearing that my military achievements would overshadow his business success in our father's estimation. Derek had encouraged his mother's treatment of me because it reinforced his position as the preferred child, the one whose civilian accomplishments aligned with Patricia's social ambitions. The conversation lasted 3 hours, covering 25 years of family dysfunction with the honesty that sometimes emerges when death forces people to confront their mistakes. Derek couldn't undo the damage his behavior had caused, and I couldn't forget the pain his rejection had inflicted, but we could acknowledge the truth of what had happened and choose how to move forward. I accepted his apology without offering forgiveness, explaining that healing from family rejection requires time, and that trust, once broken, must be rebuilt through consistent action rather than words. Derek nodded, understanding that our conversation marked the beginning of a possible relationship rather than the restoration of a family connection that had never truly existed. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, Derek mentioned something that surprised me. He'd been following my advocacy work through newspaper articles and community publications, feeling proud of my achievements while simultaneously regretting that he'd never expressed that pride directly. He asked if there were ways he could support the Veterans Crisis Intervention Program, perhaps through financial contributions or volunteer work that might help other military families avoid the conflicts that had damaged ours. I gave him information about our programs, explaining that meaningful support required more than financial donations, that helping military families meant understanding military culture and respecting the values that drive service members to prioritize duty over personal comfort. Derek listened with attention I'd never received from him during our childhood, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions about how civilian families could better support military relatives. Our conversation didn't resolve 18 years of family conflict, but it opened the possibility for future connection based on mutual respect rather than obligated tolerance. Derek left Phoenix with a better understanding of the consequences his behavior had created, and I departed with closure regarding Patricia's motivations and some hope that family relationships could evolve even after years of dysfunction. The wooden box Derek had returned now sits on my father's desk in the study I've converted into a home office. Inside, my mother's jewelry catches afternoon sunlight streaming through windows Patricia had once covered with heavy drapes designed to block the desert brightness she'd found overwhelming. The love letters my parents had exchanged during their separation reveal a relationship based on mutual respect, shared values, and deep affection for the daughter they'd created together. Reading those letters has helped me understand that the love my father felt for me was rooted in the love he'd shared with my mother, that my military service honored both their memories, and that Patricia's jealousy had been directed at a connection she could never break despite 18 years of effort. Today, as evening light fades over the cemetery where my father rests beneath a simple military headstone, I sit on the memorial bench donated in his honor and reflect on the journey that began when 6 Marines walked through rain to deliver his flag. That moment of recognition and respect launched a healing process that continues to this day, connecting me to a community that understands both service and sacrifice. The flag those Marines carried to me hangs in a place of honor in my living room, displayed in a case donated by the Marine Corps League, along with my father's Vietnam service medals and the Navy Cross I earned in his memory. Visitors to my home see evidence of military heritage and continuing service, understanding that this house belongs to someone who values honor, duty, and mutual support. My chosen family of Marines has expanded to include veterans from all service branches, their spouses and children, and civilian allies who understand that supporting military families means more than displaying yellow ribbon magnets or offering discounts to service members. These relationships provide the belonging that biological family couldn't offer, the acceptance that comes from shared experience and mutual respect. Staff Sergeant Shen visits monthly, bringing stories about veterans he's counseling and updates on Marines we've helped through our various programs. Lance Corporal Williams coordinates our college scholarship initiatives, ensuring that military children receive educational opportunities regardless of their family's financial circumstances. Sergeant Rodriguez manages our family mediation services, helping military families navigate conflicts before they reach the point of permanent estrangement. Together, we've created something my father would have recognized and approved: a network of mutual support that honors military values while addressing civilian needs. A community that takes care of its members without requiring blood relationships or social credentials. The trust fund my father established continues to grow, providing resources for programs that support military families in crisis. Each scholarship awarded, each family reunited, each veteran connected to supportive community represents a continuation of his quiet service and a testament to values that transcend individual mortality. As darkness settles over the cemetery and streetlights begin to illuminate the pathways between memorial sections, I stand to leave the bench where I've spent the evening remembering and planning. Tomorrow brings new challenges: veterans to counsel, families to support, programs to develop, and communities to build. The flag 6 Marines carried to me through December rain was more than a symbol of my father's service. It was an invitation to join a community that understands both loss and resilience, that knows how to transform grief into purpose and pain into service. That invitation continues to shape my life and work, reminding me daily that family is often less about genetics than about values, less about obligation than about choice. Walking through the cemetery toward my car, I pass headstones marking the graves of hundreds of veterans whose service spanned multiple wars and decades of peacetime duty. Each marker represents someone who chose to serve something larger than themselves, who understood that individual sacrifice could contribute to collective security and shared prosperity. My father's grave is marked with the same simple dignity: name, rank, dates of service, and the eagle, globe, and anchor that identifies him as a Marine who answered his country's call. No mention of Patricia's social achievements or Derek's business success, just the essential truth of a life dedicated to service and family in ways that mattered when the final accounting was made. The 6 Marines who walked through rain that December morning gave me more than military honors and family support. They introduced me to a way of living that prioritizes service over recognition, duty over comfort, and community over individual ambition. Through them, I learned that the most meaningful inheritance isn't material wealth or social position, but the example of how to serve others with honor and humility regardless of personal cost. That lesson continues to guide my work with veterans facing family rejection, my advocacy for military families in crisis, and my commitment to building communities that support those who've served our country. It's a lesson that began with 6 Marines carrying a flag through rain and continues with every veteran we help find belonging, every family we reunite, and every community we strengthen through mutual support and shared purpose. The December rain that fell during my father's funeral has long since dried, but the seeds it watered continue to grow into programs, relationships, and communities that honor his memory while serving current needs. That's the real legacy of the moment when 6 Marines chose to walk through a cemetery to deliver a flag to a grieving daughter. Not just recognition of past service, but commitment to continuing service that transforms individual loss into collective healing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.